Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start. Welcome to another session number 5 of the Foundations of the Requirements Development and Management course for Business Data Analytics. For those of you that are new, welcome. For those of you that have been coming back, welcome back. There's more of this geeking out that we've been doing, just going through all the different foundational information that's all standards based. And what I tell everybody, what I tell everybody about the class is that if you're challenged with requirements, you're not alone, because everybody is trying to figure out how to do it correctly the first time. And to prove the point, I have the slide up here with all the different groups that are involved in trying to come up with a standard way to elicit, analyze, document, and validate requirements. What I've done is built a class on a traditional framework of elicit, analyze, document, and validate for a requirements class. The only thing I've done differently is I've specialized the content towards business data analytics, which is the language of data. We've been working through the foundation section for the last 4 weeks. This is week number 5. If you send me an email, rfrederick.pmp@gmail.com, I will send you back all of the videos and PDFs of the classes that we've done so far. So I'll catch you up very, very quickly in the event that this is your first opportunity with us. A little bit about me, just very quickly. In the 1990s, I started a software company that was focused on software integration and workflow automation. I did that for about 5 or 6 years until 2001, 2002. I left and went to work for Apple. There's a long story behind all this. I worked for Apple Computer for a couple of years, and then I left and I started teaching classes specifically about project management and business analysis. Interestingly enough, I thought back in 2005 that almost everything that I'm teaching now would have already been taught. But luckily, or for me, it took about 15 years for the rest of the world to catch up. So, which is good because it's made it a lot more interesting. There's a lot of information today to share. Most of this information that I'm providing to you is out in the open source world. It's all open source. Please feel free to take it, share it with anybody that you wish, but it's not normally found in a traditional business analysis course, which is why I took it upon myself to try to put this together. This section that we're getting into, so let me give you kind of the background, previous sections that we've gone into. The premise of the class is to understand that data is the language of intelligence. Intelligent assistants that we use are going to be using to help us get our jobs done. And one of the things that I'm always trying to impress upon business analysts is that your job is absolutely going to change. I always talk about people in automation, and people are fearful that automation is going to take their job. It's only going to take your job if your job is absolutely repetitive, meaning it's just a mindless, brainless, repetitive function. That kind of work will easily be done by automation. However, your job is not repetitive as a business analyst. What's really fascinating, and we've never really gotten to get into this because of just the nature of the fact that I only have 30 minutes, but I want to point out to you that what I tell all my students in the classes is that there's a lot of skills that I can teach to an analyst, but the one thing that I cannot teach that really will determine whether or not you're successful or not as an analyst is your own curiosity. And if you're really curious, this is the greatest job in the world because there's no end in sight to all of the things that you have to learn. I've been working on this for 20, 25 years, and I'm just barely scratching the surface. I mean, truly jack of all trades, master of none. And every time I go out and I elicit requirements from some subject matter expert, it makes me realize how awesome the job is because there's just so much that you get to learn. That being said, It's also very difficult to successfully elicit requirements from people. Why? Because of the nature of human language. Human language tends to be a nuanced ambiguity, and what we have to do as business analysts is convert that into some sort of structured English or structured query language, some sort of structured language that can then be turned into software and ultimately tested. So in the previous webinars that we've done, we've spent a lot of time talking about thinking like a tester, thinking like a tester, thinking like a tester. In this particular one, we're going to kind of veer off the technology side and focus on business vocabulary and rules. So the theme that I'm going to go with from here on out, every event that I do from here on out, is the concept of seek to understand. That as analysts, that's really what we're paid to do, is we are constantly paid to try to understand what the business wants and what the technology is capable of. And our mission is to marry those two together within a context or a framework that is acceptable to the institution. So every institution, whether it's documented or undocumented, has two things that you have to learn about as an analyst. One is the business vocabulary of the institution, which is within the dictionaries that are either physical or intangible in software. The other half of this challenge is understanding business rules, which are really the policies that are found in the operating manuals of the machine. So one of the things I'm always trying to impress upon people is to think of your institution as a machine and all of the humans as working parts. And what's happening is we're taking what you know as a human and we're pulling it out of your brain, whether you like it or not, and we're putting it into the information systems in the form of intellectual property. And you'll see along the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see all the different roles that are involved in what we have as the 6 steps of data mining and machine learning, which is the fundamental concept behind business intelligence and eventually intelligent assistance, the dashboards that we work with, and eventually the cognitive services of communicating with those dashboards through our voice. So at the top, just really quickly, I've got my business analyst, product owner, whose job it is to kind of understand the business. And underneath that, I have my Scrum Master project manager, whose job it is to understand the data. Underneath that, I have my IT system architect, whose job it is to prep the data. Under that, I have my developer or my subject matter expert, whose role or job is to build the model that's necessary to either query the solution or automate the solution. Underneath that, I have my, my QA tester, whose job it is to validate the data. And then at the very bottom, you'll see that there's a person in blue. That's Cortana from Microsoft. And that's the example of the intelligent assistant, which is where the solution will ultimately be deployed to. So we're going to go from understanding the business all the way down to deploying the solution after we go through testing. So again, you know, just knowing this as an analyst and being prepared for this is going to help you as we transition into the next phase of information systems. This particular section is from the object management. Let me just go back really quickly. So there's 2 groups. There's the object management group, and then there's the International Standards Organization. And this material is really from the object management group, but the ISO provides a lot of the information to the object management group. And if you're not familiar with those groups, I highly recommend you go seek them out on the internet. Anyway, within the object management group, we talk about something known as a communication model. And this model is where all the problems begin. The idea that we have a sender and a receiver, all right? So the sender, so what I have on the sender side are my stakeholders, and obviously I have my team on the receiver side. And the sender encodes a message, and then that message is then sent through some sort of channel to a receiver where it's decoded. Sorry about that. Anyway, and then the receiver takes that message and does something with it, and then eventually encodes a response and sends it back to the sender. So you can think of it like the original requirement coming across the top, and at the bottom, user acceptance testing at the very bottom. So it's almost like we went through the process and looped back, all right? Anybody that's been in this business knows that it sounds so simple on paper. It sounds like everybody understands what's going on. Well, they don't. And now we're going to explain why, okay? So what's really fascinating is the psychology of all of the relationships between the humans that are communicating. And everybody that I've dealt with has kind of an initial belief that we're all speaking the same language. And we might be speaking the same language, but how we view the information, how we think about it may be very different amongst each other. Okay, so we're going to kind of talk a little bit about this, and we're going to introduce you to two terms. One is known as a semantic community, which is, you know, kind of the organizational or institutional language of your whole organization. And then we're going to introduce this concept called a speech community, which is a very targeted select group. So for example, you might have a group of business people who have their own language, and it's an accounting language. Great. And you may have a group of technical people that have their own language, and it's a technology language. And obviously, the business people are trying to get the technology people to do something. The challenge is making sure that it's communicated effectively. And in the previous classes, we talked about how the statement of a need, the subordinate clause of a test case, isn't always clear. We need it done this way by tomorrow. I mean, very, very vague. And that our job as an analyst is to take that information and go back and figure out the main clause, the given and the when, in order to trigger the then statement, then the need shall be fulfilled, okay? So we have up here kind of the concept of the model where we've got on one side the stakeholders who have a mindset of what they think they're representing and what they're saying, and then they're expressing that to the recipients who are trying to figure out what they're saying. And even when you write it down in notes, it's not always exact, which is why when people say, hey, how do I get the requirements right the first time around? My answer is, I don't know, because it just depends on the communication it's occurring with you and your stakeholders. So this is going to give you some background as to why it's so confusing. So we're going to give you these two terms. And again, I didn't create any of this. This is all open source, standards-based. So this is just information that as you begin to pursue this in some level of depth, it should come up eventually. But the first thing is this concept of the semantic community. And the semantic community I like to think of as your institution, where again, inside of a large institution, you have a standard language that you guys share. You might have a standard vocabulary, you might have acronyms that you share, great. And the theory is that institutionally, we all speak the language. We do, but we interpret the language differently. That's where it gets a little bit more challenging. Within the shared community, you have all of these different target audiences, and they all have their own language. So for example, employees have jargon and abbreviations and transaction codes and form numbers. The legal department has contracts and product and service specifications and compliance reporting. And then outside, the general public has its own view of your institution and your language based on advertising or public-facing websites or scripts for help desks or anything that you do to interface. So those are just examples of different speech communities, or what I like to call target audiences. Well, that's not easy to deal with when you're trying to build things that are specific transactional systems. And in addition to that, we have to deal with this idea of conversion. So converting from, a shared large-scale semantic community down to a very specific targeted speech community and doing it consistently across the institution. So what does that really mean? Well, what we have to do is come up with a standard language. And what is that? Well, that's ultimately going to be a dictionary and an operating manual with rules. Now, that's pretty much what it is. So the theory should be that you have one master dictionary for them all. But the reality is that everybody seems to have their own dictionary, and they have their own glossaries, and they have their own terminology. And that creates rework. And that's one of the biggest challenges that we have as analysts, is how do we overcome the constant amount of rework that we have due to the fact that once we go through the entire communication cycle or communication model, we get back to our stakeholders, they do not pass user acceptance testing. So we start off in a meeting, we listen to what they say, we write everything down, and then we, go through our process and we run through all of our different team members and we develop what we think is exactly what they want. And we bring it back to them and go, well, that's not exactly what we want. Now, the theory is, and there are many different methodologies towards this. There's the long cycle of the waterfall or the short cycle of the agile. It doesn't really matter. The reality is that sometimes you get information and for whatever reason, it's not interpreted exactly the way the shareholders or the stakeholders thought that they were presenting it. That's just part of nuance. So what we want to do is, if we're in an organization, we want to start with existing documentation. I'm always telling people, hey, don't invent this stuff. It should already be there. The idea is to seek it out, hence seek to understand. You want to seek out standard business rules and policy manuals. And it's really funny because I always tell people I love to read operating manuals. Everybody thinks I'm crazy, but I love reading dictionaries and I love reading operating manuals. Why? Because it explains to you as an analyst how the machine works. And it's fascinating. Like I said, the larger the machine, if you got 100,000 employees, you have a giant machine with 100,000 moving parts. And that's a very fascinating institution to be inside of as a business analyst. I love, the bigger the machine, the more interesting it is, the more stuff I got to learn. So I think this is the greatest job in the world for that reason alone. But what we're looking for is standardized glossaries, and we're looking for standardized operating manuals, rule books. Okay, that's what we're looking for. Now, just a quick thing, and again, these are foundational concepts as part of a larger course where I would actually walk you through a lot of this information in more detail with more hands-on exercises and things of that nature. So again, this is just foundational stuff that's early in the idea. Existing documents should be there, but there is no end to the insane things organizations do or fail to do. Absolutely. This is what makes it so fun, is the theory is it's all supposed to be there. But the reality is it's almost never there. And you have to stop and try to figure out, well, what do we do? How do we go about doing this? And I'll tell you this, any project that you work on where something is missing, just recognize that every project is rehearsal or preparation for the next one. So a lot of times what you'll find is that you have to create something that doesn't exist in the current project, but if you set it up properly, you can reuse it indefinitely. That's one of the 2 keys to efficiency that I'll teach you guys on another webinar. I'll teach you how to be really efficient with 1 slide and only 2 things you got to know. So it makes it real simple. But the idea behind all this is that you have to have an operating manual. And as an analyst, if the operating manual doesn't exist, then you really need to be spearheading the job of creating it or adding to it or documenting all of these things. That, even though it's not, quote, your job, it will benefit you dramatically to be a part of anything that has to do with structure, understanding operational policy, all of that stuff. Because a lot of people who are analysts do policy procedure redesigns. So one of the things I'm always telling analysts that's really cool about our job is that we get to design work for other people. And usually we have a couple of ways we could do it. The last class or the last webinar I talked about kind of the two ideas are, I don't know if it was this or not. You guys are not, but I'll just tell you really quickly. There's really two ways to design work. There's the complex way and the easy way. I'm checking my time. I got plenty of time today. So I'm going to start with macaroni and cheese. Something hopefully everybody is familiar with, macaroni and cheese. Cheese and noodles. Okay, so I walk into a lot of institutions where people who work there feel like in order to validate their existence, everything needs to be really complex. And I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying that's kind of how they look at the world. And what they do in that process is they make the work very complex. They have very detailed work breakdown structures that are very hard to get humans to actually do because most humans have their own mind about the work that's necessary to get the job done. All right. So I joke about there's two different kinds of like designs of work. There's the hard way. So we'll say macaroni and cheese. So one group says, hey, we're going to do macaroni and cheese. What we're going to do is we're going to open a dairy farm and a wheat farm. And we're going to plant the wheat and grow the wheat and process the wheat into macaroni. And then we're going to have a dairy farm. We're going to own the cows and milk the cows and process the cheese, you know, into cheese. And then we're going to mix it together and do macaroni and cheese. Then there's my style, which is macaroni and cheese in a box. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set it up so that everybody who's working on my project basically gets a box with macaroni and a package with pre-made cheese. And all they got to do is boil the macaroni, drain the water, squeeze the cheese in and mix it up. It may not taste exactly the same, but it's still macaroni and cheese. The idea behind all of this is that you want to create standards that are easy for people to embrace and use. You want to create structure that's easy for people to embrace and use. Why? Well, it's going to grow complex on its own. You'll see. So let's talk about business rules. So business rules are really based on the idea of attributes of objects. So things that have descriptions, you know, we have objects and we describe them. Those are attributes. Or we have nouns that have adjectives. We just describe things. A business rule is based on a verb concept, which is built around these noun concepts. Noun concepts plays roles in verb concepts. Noun concepts are represented by terms. All right, so you start at the lowest level of these attributes that then are defining objects, which are then part of transactions. And then what the business rules do is they describe what you can and can't do, or transitions, or you know, anything that's changing around all of this stuff. At the end of the day, all of this should be listed somewhere in the form of a glossary or a dictionary. And what's fascinating to me is that in the process of assembling intellectual property together, in order for it to integrate, you have to have standard dictionaries. And the key ultimately really is to have one master dictionary to rule all of your subsidiary dictionaries. I go into places and there's different dictionaries for different pieces of software and different groups. And as you dig into these dictionaries, you start to find out that terminology doesn't match. So a term that is in a piece of software may not actually match the term that's in the operating manual rule book. Even though the term is written the same, the definitions are different. And as an analyst, this is something that you have to be on the guard for all the time. And this is part of the challenge of doing the role of being an analyst, is recognizing that there's a lot of data that's not the same. And being aware of that allows you to kind of manage that proactively. So just food for thought, just keep that in mind. Here, and we're going to kind of wrap it up here. The operating manual is what's changing for us. Information systems, you know, there's process and then there's decisions. And process is kind of the mindless, brainless work that we do, the steps, transactions, activities. But then you have decisions, the decision diamonds that you have to make. And those decision diamonds are your business rules. If this occurs, then we do that. Or if this occurs, then we do this. When we document a process or when we create a process, if we're not using existing rules and terminology, then we're creating something new that needs to be then added back into the general population of all of our terminology. So going through this process, again, I'm just going to kind of leave you with this. You got a business glossary, and as an analyst, we have to be on both sides of it. We have to know both the technology side of it, which I call the bits and bytes and packets and protocols, and we have to know the accounting side of how the business operates. I haven't really gotten into that yet in this course, but I always love shocking people when they find out that this job is an accounting job as much as it is a technology job. And they look at me like, accounting? And I'm like, yep, accounting, you know, balance sheets, income statements, cash flow statements. It's an accounting job. Why? Well, at the end of the day, every single requirement is a piece of intellectual property that has to be inventoried for reuse. So if you're going to operate your business efficiently, which you need to do in order to actually implement intelligence. See, here's the irony of it. As long as we aren't well integrated, as long as our shop doesn't run efficiently, then we really can't take advantage of intelligence. Until your shop is set up to operate efficiently, only when your shop is set up to operate efficiently can you then take advantage of intelligence. Intelligence isn't going to eliminate the decision making. Intelligence is going to enable you to get more done with the same staff by having the intelligent assistant do repetitive work. We haven't really spent a lot of time on that. I got into a little bit at the very beginning, the very first session when I talked about dashboards and robots. But so the premise behind this whole course is that at the end of the day, what are we really trying to standardize? Well, first of all, terminology in order to support data. So you look down at this kind of bullet and we talk about the business glossary, you talk about a taxonomy, which is all the hierarchical relationships that we have to deal with, requirements, traceability as an example. We have a thesaurus that's absolutely necessary because institutionally, there are tremendous numbers of synonyms for the same thing. You know, this is called all these different names throughout all the different departments or speech communities, but they all mean the same thing. And of course, that creates a challenge because then there's the opportunity to have rework because you're using different words to describe the exact same thing. In addition, we have a very rich vocabulary based on the fact that everybody who operates within this machine is a subject matter expert in their own job title. And the challenge there is I talk to multiple subject matter experts with the same job title, only to find out that they all speak a slightly different taxonomy or glossary of terms. Meaning everybody's got a little bit of different angle on what they're explaining. They're trying to get to the same result, but how they're explaining it and the terms that they're using aren't always the same. And then on top of that, you might have language barriers where you have different languages with different meanings. So all of these things need to be documented in some central repository. So this part of the course, or just talking about it, this is really specific to more of the business side of the terminology, but can also include the technical side. So I'm not one of those people that believes that they're really kind of separated. I think that they're very closely aligned where the business term and the technology term should be in a same dictionary, at least referenced by the same dictionary records. Then you get into where it says, you know, terminology ontology, which is kind of the overall concept of just terminology. But relations among instances or data tables of concepts of objects. And then we have these definitional rules, which are, I call transitions, conversions, and limitations. And then we get in, we talk about definitions and relationships and rules specified in formal logic. For example, in the last section, we talked about testing. I showed an example, actually it was the earlier one, when I talked about structured English. I showed the example of a table of if then else statements that really represented business rules. So it was, you know, written out in a table, and it's showing this kind of information, this formal logic and all of the different variations. It's called value to the power of, see, I can't remember what it is. It'll come to me. Constraint, value to the power of constraint. I think it is what it is. Anyway. And then behavioral rules, which is kind of the organizational policy, rules governing business actions or decisions. So it's interesting. This side of it, the object management group is really focused more on the business side, the accounting side, as opposed to the technology side. All right. So bottom line, what I was trying to get to was this. Again, all these sections are what I call train the trainer. So feel free. This is all open source. Feel free to share this with anybody that you wish. But as an analyst, it's really important that you think in terms of business vocabulary or vocabulary, not just business vocabulary, but vocabulary dictionaries. And then business rules or rules operating manuals. The thing that and again, I have an opinion about some of this. My only opinion about this is that all of it is business vocabulary. So when someone says, oh, it's technical vocabulary, well, it's all part of the business, whatever your business is. And so when we say business vocabulary, we're not saying as mutually exclusive to technical information. We're saying an overarching umbrella or concept that really covers everything. So this is the part. If you're an analyst and you're curious, go seek out dictionaries and go seek out operating manuals, and it will help you really begin to understand how your institution operates as a machine. All right. So that's the end of this session. Are there any questions? You guys got any questions?
I don't have a question.
Okay.
But I do have a comment.
Okay.
That sometimes I've dealt with cases where the terminology has the same label, but they have slightly different meanings, where it's almost like you have to look at the intersection between the two terms. And then when you have synonyms for them or aliases, I've had to do the base core definition and then say, okay, this is this plus that.
Okay.
And then the other definition, it's almost like when you look at a database query where you're trying to join tables.
Yes, that's a great analogy.
Yeah, you have the intersection, and then you have stuff outside of it. You just have to understand and define the inside and the outside.
Yep, that's a great analogy. The whole idea of having a join table of different dictionaries is really what's going on. That's a great point. Anybody else? I'm writing down everybody's name, so just so I know. All right. If you guys, again, I am, excellent, thank you. Would there be any interest in following a series of webinars that provide slightly different but entirely complementary take? Okay. I actually, again, I love all of it. I love business analysis. I love project management, but I feel like as a person, I'm probably more closely aligned with business analysis because I have this insatiable curiosity about how the machine operates. And again, I love the fact that there's all of these different standards and no one's really sort of nailed it, which again, just goes to show you how complex it is. So next week, we're going to talk about the Nkosi rules of writing requirements, which is kind of a structure for how to write requirements. And then the week after that, we're going to talk about the IEEE has this really great thing called EARS, the Easy Approach to Requirements Syntax, which I absolutely love. I use a lot of that in the stuff that we're talking about. And I'm going to touch on a product that's called QV Scribe that allows people to help them. It's a intelligent writing tool. It's like Grammarly for writing requirements is how I put it. So let's see. Anything else?
Yeah, Richard, you mentioned earlier that some people tend to complex things because of the way they see the world.
Yes.
Unnecessarily. And if you're a BA and you see that things could be easier or more straightforward, should you clash against that situation or just play along?
It's called Power of the Pen. And what I tell people is, so obviously you have to operate within the framework and the context of your institution. But I'm always trying to simplify, even in the work that I do. And so as one of the things that I'm going to do is I'm going to go through at another time and talk about how to be efficient. I'm going to do a whole webinar just on efficiency, because I think we tend to over complicate how to become efficient. I mean, the idea of being efficient is that you're not trying to overcomplicate things. As an analyst, part of our role is to try to make things efficient. And I think but no one's ever really taught us how to do it. So I'm going to teach you guys how to be efficient in one of these webinars right after I do the agile versus waterfall assembly methods. I'll come back and I'll do efficiency as the first of the next series that I put up there. But again, my mindset is that as an analyst, I'm always trying to be efficient, regardless of the environment that I'm in. And I tell everybody, every project is rehearsal or preparation for the next project. So we may not expect you to be efficient in this one. So the first time you do it, you're not going to be as efficient. But if you do it again and again and again, parts of the projects are the same. I mean, the whole entire project won't be, but parts of them will be. And the more you can make that part of it efficient on your own in the background, to kind of answer that directly. When we get into, and I teach you a little bit about efficient, I'll just tell you really quickly. One of the keys to being efficient is having a standard coding system. And this presentation about dictionaries sort of feeds into ultimately where I would be teaching everybody about how you create coding systems to then create an inventory of reusable objects that creates efficiency just by the nature of that concept. So in the background, while you might have people trying to be very, very complex, as an analyst, you're always looking for how do we make this more efficient? Where can I eliminate a step or two through each process? I know that was a long-winded way of answering your question, but did I answer your question?
Oh, certainly, yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, reading manuals. It's so funny because I do love reading manuals, and you really do have to be curious. If you're curious about your shop, it makes the job so much interesting. I tell people, okay, I don't have time for this, but I'll just tell you really quickly. You can hate your job, but love your craft. And what I mean by that is there's things about everybody's job that they don't particularly like. As a business analyst, part of your craft is seeking to understand. So when you love your craft, seek to understand, it makes working in the shop that much more interesting, which makes it compelling to come back to work every day. Even if the whole place is kind of crazy, I'm always engaged by the fact that there's so much to learn. And the great thing about being a business analyst is we're supposed to learn as much as we can. Jack of all trades, master of none. So if you're curious, you just keep digging. Just keep digging. Let's see. Excellent. All right. Anything else? then thank you all for coming out. And again, send me an email and I'll send you the slide deck and all of the previous last 4 webinars. And I'm ahead of schedule now. So I'm setting up so that each at the end of this, I can send you the last ones. I finally got my own process going. So, all right. Thank you all for coming out, and we'll call it a day.